Hello, I'm Sky Matsuhashi, founder of SmartPokerStudy.com, the place for poker players who are always striving to be better today than they were yesterday. Poker people, if you missed episode 116 called Breaking Down the Rejam, then stop this episode right now. Go download and listen to 116, then come back to me. Go on, I don't mind waiting. Hey, poker people, and welcome back, I meant to say. I'm so glad that 100% of you who missed last episode went back and listened to it just now. Or I meant to say went black and listened to it just now. Geez, I'm getting everything mixed up. So, and a big welcome to you if you just discovered this podcast. And if you're an oldie but a goodie, or maybe long time, first time, or an old hat, or if you've been around this block before, I'm glad you're back. It's you and me working together that's keeping this ship afloat. So this entire month of January, I'm releasing some Patreon-only podcasts to build anticipation for January's Patreon theme of Mashing the Micros. My goal by doing this is to show you the extra value that Patreon supporters receive beyond my standard hugs and kisses, you know? Ultimately, I hope many of you out there will decide to become Patreon supporters so you can receive bonus podcasts and videos and webinar content just like what you're about to hear. The theme for September's Patreon rewards was hand reading, and this is the first of 3 rewards that I sent out to my supporters back in October after that month of September ended here. Now, for a little overview of today's episode, the hand reading steps. Nice and simple, but it's very powerful. I'm going to discuss what hand reading is all about and how learning this skill will benefit our poker game in so many ways. I break down my hand reading steps by discussing my special HAND acronym. Lots of great stuff to discuss, so we'll get moving. And grooving, of course. Hit the show notes page for everything discussed today at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod117.
And now for our feature presentation.
So I want to kick this thing off with a couple of my favorite quotes of all time. The first one, practice does not make perfect. Only perfect practice makes perfect. And that's from Vince Lombardi. And another one, probably from a guy, possibly you've never heard of before. And the quote goes, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. And this is from Richard Marcinko. He's the author of Rogue Warrior, or the whole Rogue Warrior series, or 6 or 7 books. I can't remember exactly. But some great quotes right there about practice being perfect. I'm sorry, not about practice being perfect. Perfect practice making you perfect. And the more you sweat in training, or for us, the more off the felt studying that you do in regards to poker, of course. And, the better you're going to be when it comes to in-game play. The less chips you'll spew, the less, the better you'll do in tournaments, the better you'll do in cash games, all that jazz, So training and perfect practice really does make or break your game. So, today, of course, is all about hand reading. So, what is hand reading and why should you care? And hand reading is the skill of deducing what hands our opponent likely has, and we use this information to exploit the opponent. We're either earning more chips because we can go for thinner value, or even just greater value. We know the guy is going to call. We can go for a full pot size bet instead of just half pot or whatever. And we're also saving ourselves chips because we're able to avoid paying off our opponent when we know that we're likely beat. If we can put them on a narrow range of cards and make solid decisions based on this narrow range and the reasoning that we put in, we'll be profiting like mad from this skill. And, I'll be honest, for the longest time, I had issues with hand reading because I had no idea how to do it. I would sometimes start hand reading on the flop or the turn, and most of the time, I would try to put my opponent on one exact holding. I was often not taking into account the type of opponent I was up against, maybe their bet sizing or their likely pre-flop ranges. I was screwing things up totally. I was just botching everything big time when it came to hand reading. But once I learned how to hand read, a whole new world of poker exploitation and opportunities opened up to me. I was getting more out of my study time off the felt because I was finally doing things right and taking into account all the information, all the little things that I never thought of before. I was taking all that into account now to arrive at a better decision later on. And I was feeling more confident, or later on in the hand, I mean to say, I was feeling more confident while at the tables, and I was starting to make bigger laydowns, as well as calling bets and making more raises, or, well-timed, better placed raises, and I was doing all this more confidently and correctly, and that's actually a very important aspect, all the confidence in the world doesn't mean crap if you're not correct in your decisions. Also, I know I was being more helpful in forums and Facebook posts because I was able to give more detailed analysis of other people's hand histories, when they put them up there and ask some questions about it. And one great side effect of proper hand reading practice is an increased understanding of your opponents. When you're forced to think more critically and logically about your opponent's decisions, you start to make more connections in your mind between opponent actions, bet sizings, and whole card ranges. You become a greater force to reckon with at the tables through your understanding of your opponents. Another benefit of proper hand reading is that now you're on your way to becoming the player that you're scared to face. I can hear your ego telling yourself right now, bullshit, you ain't afraid of no man.
You know something. What is it?
I'm scared, Pancho.
Bullshit. You ain't afraid of no man.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
Hey, if you can't admit it to yourself, no worries. I'll do it for you. Yes, you are scared to face those soul readers, the Ivies and Negranus of the world. The toughest players to face are those that understand what you're capable of, can follow the action street by street. They can narrow your range based on your decisions, then destroy you with great bluffs and value bets, or they can get away from any hand and just never pay you off. Yep, hand reading practice, and admittedly, a hell of a lot of it, is what gets you to the caliber of soul reader. Hey, no worries, I ain't there yet, but I will be soon, and so can you. So that brings us to the main point of this podcast, the steps to hand reading. So before you start hand reading practice, you're going to need 3 things. Number 1 is hand histories from Poker Tracker 4 or another poker tracking software, or like I'd already mentioned, Facebook posts, other people putting up hand histories, whatever. You just need a pretty detailed hand history to go through. The second thing that you need is an equity calculating software, and I definitely recommend Flopzilla. That's how I do all of my hand reading ever since I first picked up Flopzilla for like $35, whatever it costs. It's been the number 1 equity calculating software that I use in every single study session. And the third thing that you'll need when you're doing some hand reading practice is, of course, my hand reading steps. And I mentioned it earlier, but hand reading is not about putting another player on one specific hand. That's a very tall order, and it doesn't happen too often. Or you can do it every single time, but you're not going to be correct too often. What we're trying to do is put an opponent on a range of hands. And I'm sure most of you know this already because I've talked about it so much. But a range of hands is a set of hands that a player is likely holding based on the actions taken throughout the hand. Great hand readers start by giving their opponent an accurate pre-flop range. Then they're able to narrow it down through the streets, sometimes by as much as like 90% based on the actions of the opponents. At any given time, they have this range held within their thoughts, and they make positive EV actions based on the range they assign their opponent. I developed my own 4-step hand reading process, and it's easy to remember because it's using HAND, HAND, as an acronym for the steps. So HAND is history, assign, narrow, and destroy, or ditch your hand if necessary. So now we'll cover each of these in greater detail than I ever have in the past. So the first one, of course, the H in hand is for history. When you're hand reading a specific opponent, your history with that opponent will factor greatly in your hand reading success. You have to take into account many things. First off is the type of player they are. Next, any showdown hands of theirs that you've seen, any HUD stats you may have if you're playing online with them, their general image at the table, and also how you think they view you, of course. When you're hand reading, you need to get in their mindset. This can be tough to do because, of course, not everyone thinks like you do. You know, every player has logic for the plays they make. However twisted that logic might be. Maybe you would never be the third limper in a pot with pocket aces, and you think it's crazy to do so. But you'll sometimes encounter players who think that this kind of play is just fine. So you've got to ask yourself, why is that? What are they thinking, and how are they planning on making money by overcalling with the nuts pre-flop? How do they play with that kind of hand like that? So the better you understand your opponent, the more accurate you'll be in your hand reading off and on the tables. But what if you don't know jack about this player? Well then, population tendencies will help you here. You play in whatever stakes or card rooms that you play in, and they're very likely different from mine. The tag players at my stakes may play very differently than those at your stakes. The loose passive fish maybe call wider and limp more frequently in my card room than they do in yours. So when you don't know the player, base your assumptions on the type of player they are within your games. In order to do this, you need to pay attention to the players at your tables. Don't worry if you don't really do that already, The more you practice hand reading and the more perfect practice that you put in, the more you'll notice that similar player types all make the same sorts of decisions. Use this knowledge to understand your unknown opponents in your card rooms. Alrighty, on to the A in hand. Assign. It's time to assign a pre-flop range to our opponent based on pre-flop actions, as well as the history, of course. Now, I've got to say it, and I know it's something you don't want to hear, but we have to make assumptions when we assign a pre-flop range. Assumptions, you say? No! I want to be exact! Well, sorry to break the news, but in poker, we're often working off of assumptions. Now, they're educated assumptions based on history and logic, but assumptions nonetheless. Let's say you've got 500 hands on an opponent, and you've never seen them limp with pocket tens or ace-queen or better. You've seen limps with nines and worse, and, maybe as well as ace-jack. They just entered a pot by limping in the middle position. You're going to start assigning a range here, but will this range include pocket tens or ace-queen or better? Probably not. You've got lots of hands on them, as well as the fact that they open limped. Great. Leave out the pocket tens and the ace queen, and start their range with hands outside of this range, outside of these strong hands. You've made an assumption about their pre-flop range, but a good one based on history, their pre-flop action, and of course, logic. Assigning an accurate pre-flop range is very important in hand reading, and the reason for this is the pre-flop range is as wide as their range will ever be. If you put them on a range where, for example, maybe the worst aces they can have is ace-10, then when they come out firing on the turn, with the board being, let's say it's a king-deuce-3-5 board, king-deuce-3-5, you can't put them on an ace-4 for a straight because that hand wasn't in their pre-flop range that you assigned. Now, this doesn't mean we want to just assign a wide pre-flop range no matter what so that we don't miss any hands. Far from it. I don't ever want to hear you say, or actually I don't ever want to hear myself say this for that matter. I don't know what he might have. I'll just give him 20% and go from there. Psh. That's just loser, non-thinking, lazy talk, lazy mentality. Use your noggin to assign a logical pre-flop range and try to get it as narrow and as small as you can make it. The less hands in their pre-flop range, the easier it is to hand read and narrow their range through the streets. But if you err on the conservative side and assign a slightly wider range if you just can't go too narrow. Because assigning accurate pre-flop ranges is so important, you'll want to save your ranges within Flopzilla for quick reference and for tweaking as you go about your hand reading journey. You might start with an idea that maybe a 10% calling range in Flopzilla is jacks through deuces, ace-10 suited or better, ace-jack offsuit, or better, king-jack off and queen-jack suited. But maybe you've assigned this range many times, and you've seen players show down jack-10 suited and king-10 suited. Well, anecdotal evidence is important when assigning ranges, so you might want to tweak your 10% calling range, add back that jack-10 suited and king-10 suited. This bumps the range up to 10.6%. So you might want to remove a hand or two, or just keep it there for a 10.6% range. All of this practice with Flopzilla and ranges gets easier as you go, and you'll also get more accurate as you practice. Remember what Vince Lombardi said, practice does not make perfect. Only perfect practice makes perfect. One very important thing to remember about making assumptions and assigning a pre-flop range is that you're going to be wrong very often. I want you to expect it and accept it. Don't let it tilt you and don't get angry. It's part of the hand reading territory. But the more you work at it, the better you'll get. It's just like Richard Marchenko said, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. So make your mistakes now off the tables so that when you're on the tables, you have more practice under your belt, and you'll be doing a lot better. And you'll want to make sure you're always taking notes on what your opponents show up with, knowing that somebody has slow played a flop set, and maybe they've slow played it on the flop and the turn. Well, that can inform your future hand reading versus this opponent. I know you want to support the show, and one way you could do so is by visiting today's sponsor, Habwin.com. That's Habwin, Habwin.com. I know you like online poker, just like me. What if you could win prizes at zero cost? With Habwin, you could play free, exclusive $100 free rolls on Party Poker and BWin. Check out our winter free rolls every Sunday at 8 p.m. Central European Time. It's your chance to jump at the opportunity to win extra cash completely for free. Register now at www.habwin.com/free rolls and start the fun. So, if you can play on Party Poker or BWin, support the show by visiting Habwin and registering for free. Once again, that's habwin.com/free rolls. Alrighty, let's get back to my 4 steps to hand reading. Alrighty, so we've thought about our history with the opponent and then assigned a preflop range based on that history coupled with their preflop actions. Now it's time to get it on with the letter N in hand. And I'm not talking nookie. Nope, let's narrow that range as the hand progresses post-flop. You narrow the opponent's range based on their actions, bet sizing, board texture, and just plain old logic. Once again, perfect practice is going to be the real game changer here. You'll make plenty of mistakes when you start out narrowing ranges as the streets progress, but don't beat yourself up. Use your mistakes as fuel to push yourself to get better. Let's think about some actions and what they likely mean for your opponent's hand strength. So the first 2 actions are the most passive actions, checking and calling, and these most likely mean weakness. Whether this weakness is a complete whiff, a draw, or a weak made hand like top pair weak kicker, or second or third pair, or an under pocket pair, it likely means they aren't too gung-ho on their hand. If the board is super wet, like maybe it's 5-6-7 suited, monotone 5-6-7, and they just call your c-bet, then they could be as weak as an open-ended straight draw, a 1-card flush draw, or even have 2 pair and just be scared that you have a flopped flush or even a flopped set. Of course, calling could be slow playing, and that's why it's crucial to take notes on what you've seen your opponents do in the past. If they slow play every single time they flop a made hand, then you can't remove any flushes, straights, or sets from their range. The next play we'll look at is, of course, raising, and we all know this is often a show of strength. A real indication of how strong their hand likely is how passive or aggressive this player usually is. If the player is a loose passive calling station, then a raise often indicates strength. But if they're a lag and they bet or they raise a ton, it could mean either value raising or bluff raising. But in general, raising is strength, so you can often remove weaker hands and poor draws from their range. Okay, so now let's talk about check raising and donk leading, and this is where things start to get interesting. These are kind of tricky plays they can often be by some players. It's key to use stats to help you with these plays, or to help you understand when an opponent is making these plays. If their check raise stat or their donk lead stat is high, then they often use these plays as bluffs. And by high, I'm talking about anything over maybe 12% or so, over a good size sample. And I want you to think about that for a second. Check raising and donk leading end up bloating the pot out of position. How often do you really hit a flop hard enough to bloat that pot out of position? Not often at all, maybe 10% of the time or so. So the further away from the 10 to 12% range that they get, the more likely they use this play with whiffed hands and draws. You can often remove top pair weak kicker and second pair hands that would want to see a cheap showdown when they make one of these plays, either the check raise or the donk lead. So you'd want to keep in their bluffs and value hands when you're thinking about their range and the check raise donk lead, or check raise / donk lead. Okay, so we are following the steps for hand. First, we thought about history with the opponent to help us understand the logic they'll use through the hand. Next, we assigned a logical, accurate preflop range. Following that, we narrowed that range based on their actions through the streets. So now it's time for the D in hand, destroy. If their range is weak hand heavy, then a good sized bluff might be in order. We'll destroy them by making them fold a hand that could beat us if we get to showdown. If their range is worse than our hand, but would be willing to call a value bet, then we can size it appropriately to give us max value when we have a reasonable assumption they'll call, and that reasonable assumption is often based on the overall strength of the range that we've assigned them. If they've only got the nuts or near nuts in their range, we know we can't bluff them off the hand. So instead of destroy, it's time to ditch the hand and conserve our chips to fight another day. Our hand reading skills help us to narrow their range well enough to lead us to the most positive EV decisions, whether that be to value bet, bluff, call, maybe call to see a showdown, or fold our beaten hand. Whatever that is, if it's positive EV, we're going to make it, and we're led to that decision through hand reading. And the more perfect practice that you put in, the better you'll get at this skill, and the more exploitive and positive EV plays you'll be making versus those opponents. Alrighty, so to recap the episode, I discussed what hand reading is all about and how learning this skill will benefit our poker game in so many ways. I broke down the hand acronym and covered all 4 steps of this in great detail: history, assign, narrow, and destroy. So it's important to use what we know about our opponent, our history with them, to understand the logic they use as they play out a hand. We use our experience to assign a logical and accurate range, which we narrow as the hand progresses through the streets. We then use the final range and the strength of that range in relation to our hand to make positive EV or exploitive plays which destroy our opponent. Challenge! Here's my challenge to you for this episode. Every day, do 2 hand-reading hand history reviews on your own. Do 1 from your own gameplay and 1 from a poker forum or a Facebook group. Use Flopzilla and the hand-reading steps discussed today to put your opponent on a final range and make a decision as to what to do based on that final range. Work hard and build those hand-reading skills. Now it's your turn to take action and do something positive for your poker game.
Now get it on!
Thank you so much for listening today, and once again, thank you for your current and future Patreon support. It's incredible poker people like you who keep me going, so I'm super appreciative of all that you do. Visit www.patreon.com/smartpokerstudy to learn more and to get in on January's theme of mashing the micros. And don't forget to visit today's show notes at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod117 for everything discussed today. And of course, I want to thank our show sponsor, Habwin.com. Check out their winter free rolls every Sunday, 8 p.m. Central European Time. Visit www.habwin.com/free rolls to learn more and to register for free. Alrighty, poker peeps. Next week in episode 118, I will discuss how to handle the tilt-inducing players you often encounter in your online games and live games as well. Until next time, study smart, play much, and make your next session the best one yet.